Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. My guest on today's show is Kevin Randle. I'll be speaking with him about his book, The Washington Nationals Flying Saucers Over the Capitol. Kevin is a prominent ufologist, highly respected within the UFO community, a best-selling author, has a PhD in psychology, and was in the United States Air Force and the National Guard, where he held the rank of Lieutenant Colonel before retiring in 2009. Kevin Randle, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Well, thank you very much. And if I might be so rude as to correct you, I was also on active duty in the Army for a while.
In this updated version of your 2000 book about the sightings over Washington, D.C. in 1952, you examine the case in depth, adding additional commentary, witnesses, and new information. Where, Kevin, in Washington, D.C., were the flying saucers seen, and during what period of time did they appear?
The easiest way to answer the question is to say the period of time was July of 1952, two consecutive Saturday nights at the end of July 1952. UFOs were seen over Washington, D.C. and the surrounding areas, Virginia and Maryland, Delaware, that whole area. It involved Air Force pilots, involved civilian pilots, involved radar installations on the ground. It involved witnesses on the ground. It was responsible for the largest Air Force press conference at the time since the Second World War. Since that time, there've been other press conferences, but it involving two very high-ranking generals, Sanford, who was the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, and General Roger Ramey, the guy who was responsible in Roswell or in Fort Worth, actually, for the Roswell identification. There were a number of people involved. I was able to talk to two of them who were there on the second consecutive night. That would be Al Chop, who was the civilian Pentagon liaison for UFOs, and Major Dewey Fournet, who was directly involved in UFO investigations as well at the Pentagon. So I was able to talk to them, who were in the radar room the second night. So I have their impressions of what they'd seen, and of course all the documentation from the Project Blue Book files, the various newspapers, and other commentary.
How, Kevin, did the witnesses to the sightings describe what they saw?
Mostly it was lights in the sky, but they were solid enough to give radar returns. And we have radar returns. At one point, I think it was on 4 different radar systems, including cockpit radar of the jet interceptor set up to basically intercept the UFOs. At one point, one of the pilots said that he was surrounded by the lights. They finally went away, and he was able to get away from them as well. It was a sighting that one of them, and I don't remember whether it was Dewey Fournet or Al Chop, said it was a very hairy or very gory sighting, which they watched the intercept on the radar, so they saw what was going on. They also told me that at one point, when the interceptors would arrive on scene, all the spurious contacts, which would be the UFOs, disappeared from the radar screens. And when the interceptors left the area, those contacts returned, suggesting some kind of reaction to the presence of the interceptors. There were airline pilots who were asked to identify lights in specific areas based on what the air traffic controllers were seeing at what was Washington National Airport at the time. I think it's now the Ronald Reagan National Airport. That's why they are called the Washington Nationals, because of the airport. They would ask the airline pilots, do you see something at this point? And the pilots would report, yes, we have an object in that area. But it was basically just bright lights that were solid enough to give us radar returns.
In their effort to dismiss what so many saw, and this includes both military personnel and civilians, what was the official version given to the public and the media by government agencies about these unknown objects seen in the skies over Washington, D.C.?
Eventually, it became a temperature inversion. This is where you have an area of warm air over an area of colder air. And what it does is basically refract light. The same thing, it's like sticking a pencil in a glass of water. You know how the pencil looks like it's bent. It's kind of a refraction. That's kind of how a temperature inversion reacts. But it doesn't explain the lights that we're seeing. It doesn't explain the intercepts. It doesn't explain quite a bit of that. I think that answer kind of developed during the press conference, where they were talking about what was going on. And I think one of the radar experts, there mentioned the temperatures inversion and refraction of lights, and that just the news media and the military sort of glommed onto that as the explanation. It became the official explanation. And there may be one or two sightings there which were explained by the temperature inversion, and it was a light temperature inversion, not a heavy temperature inversion at the time, given the weather in Washington, D.C. But it just simply does not work when you take a look at the radar returns, and that's one of the key points. I think both Dewey Fournay and Al Chop told me that radar operators said these were solid returns. They weren't the result of weather phenomena or spurious weather phenomena. These were solid returns, and they were experienced enough to be able to determine whether or not the radar return they were looking at was something like a solid object or it was something created by a weather phenomenon. You've got the experts who were there looking at the scopes, telling us what they had seen, and you have the explainers off in the distance who weren't looking at the scope saying, yeah, temperature inversion explains it all, but it really doesn't. And there were so many sightings from so many different areas. You had Air Force officers involved, you had Air Force enlisted personnel involved, you had civilian airline pilots involved, you had witnesses on the ground who had no military affiliation. One of the officers who was interviewed had talked about seeing a bright orange light on the horizon about where the radar return was coming from. And later on, he said, well, it wasn't a star, it wasn't this, it wasn't that. And later on, he said, well, it was probably a star. And I think pressure was put on him by his superiors to suggest, well, maybe you made a mistake there. And I think he was smart enough to think, well, if I haven't had a mistake and my military career is going down the toilets, we'll have to amend what we have said. And that's the other thing that we see throughout the entire UFO phenomena. And they've been talking about it most recently as well, the pressure put on the witnesses, especially the military witnesses by their superiors, to conclude something that is less than exciting. You know, this was just a misidentification of a natural phenomenon, be it a weather phenomenon or an astronomical phenomenon, something like that. And I think we see that a lot. And I think you see pilots who are pressured to change their testimony. The pilot for the Japanese was 1628, flight 1628, many years later, reported a UFO, found himself out of the cockpit because he'd seen a UFO. Later, it was reinstated when pressure was brought by some of the UFO community to suggest that maybe that wasn't quite fair. But I mean, that's just another example of pressure brought to bear on pilots to amend what they've seen so that they don't report these sorts of things because they can get themselves into trouble and find themselves out of the cockpit. And imagine the pressure brought on a military pilot by his superiors. And I say his superiors because in 1952, the pilots would have all been male.
Correct.
You can imagine the pressure brought on him to change the story somewhat. Well, I got kind of excited. It wasn't quite what I said. You know, it was something a little bit different, and we can go away. But you look at the Project Blue Book files, you look at the case reports, you look at the sheer numbers of these sorts of things, and you wonder what would have inspired them to come up with this idea of flying saucers. Although I will say, I think it was after the first night, maybe the second night, there was a headline in the Cedar Rapids Gazette that I've always said is the greatest headline I've ever seen because it's right out of a science fiction movie. And it says, saucers swarm over Capitol. And you're thinking, yeah, I remember that from Earth versus the Flying Saucers, you know, that kind of thing. I've got a photo of that headline in the book so you can see exactly how. So the banner headline across the front page, saucers swarm over Capitol.
It has been said that Dwight Eisenhower, who was president at the time, had an interest in UFOs. In fact, there was a lot of buzz in the UFO community that during his presidency, Eisenhower made a number of secret trips to an Air Force base where he met with extraterrestrials. What, Kevin, is your take or knowledge of that event?
Well, first of all, we're talking July 1952, so Eisenhower hadn't been elected yet. Truman was in the White House, and he was very interested in what was going on, and he ordered the military to give me some answers. When we moved to Eisenhower, who was elected in 1952, of course, I don't find those tales of him going off to meet alien creatures to be credible. There just is nothing to follow up on it. You look at some of the really spectacular cases, and I'm thinking Roswell here, Bentwaters, which is Rendlesham Forest now. You look at some of these cases, and you have literally dozens of witnesses involved. Now, Roswell, they say Roswell was a weather balloon. That right now doesn't matter. What matters is the number of people who were involved in the retrieval operation and could talk about what they had seen and what they'd done, firsthand witnesses. Rendlesham Forest, you've got the same thing. You've got literally dozens of witnesses involved in the 3 nights of the Rendlesham Forest encounter, including high-ranking military officers who suggesting that it was something extraterrestrial as opposed to something terrestrial. When you look at these tales like President Eisenhower jetting off to Vandenberg Air Force Base, and he supposedly had an emergency dental appointment, and he was actually escorted off to see the alien creature, you cannot find additional witnesses like you can for these other tales. And there would have been people involved, any number of people involved. I was told at one point, which gets us kind of back to Roswell, that there was a pilot living in Las Cruces, I think it was, who had been a pilot for Air Force One, which is the presidential plane, of course. And he took President Kennedy to see alien bodies. And so I finally found the guy and we chatted. And yeah, he'd been a pilot for Air Force One. And yes, he'd been flown around with President Kennedy, but he never took Kennedy to see alien creatures. Instead, he had his own UFO sighting, not from Air Force One, but from a fighter plane, where he saw a craft off the wing, a dome disc, and he could see an alien creature inside the dome. So the elements were sort of there. They just got jumbled up into this tale that Kennedy had seen alien creatures. And it turned out it was the Air Force One pilot who'd flown Kennedy who'd seen an alien creature. And I mean, I talked to the guy, and very nice and very congenial, and was very forthcoming what he'd seen and how he'd done. And we were able to straighten that out. So when I wonder if there is some element of truth to it, but I don't think that Eisenhower met alien creatures. It may have been something like that Air Force One pilot I spoke to, just kind of got the facts all jumbled together.
As you point out in your book, Kevin, UFOs weren't only being spotted by radar and intercepted by fighters over Washington, D.C. in 1952. It was a scene being played out throughout the country. Tell me about some of those other sightings.
Well, a great many of them. Ed Ruppelt, who was the chief of Project Blue Book at the time, said that he had subscribed to a clipping service so they could get the news stories about UFOs from around the country. And beginning in 1952, they had come into a letter-sized envelope, not many clippings. Then the envelope got a little bit bigger. Then it was one of these big manila envelopes stuffed with clippings. Then they started coming in cardboard boxes because he was getting so many clippings about UFOs. 1952, if I remember correctly, the Air Force logged 1,500 UFO sightings, which was the most that they ever logged. And of those, 303 of them were unidentified. So it was the big year. So they're all over the country, and you can take a look at them. Some of the stories are really weird. There was one out of Florida where a scoutmaster was taking 3 scouts home from the scout meeting and saw a light in the woods off the road in Florida. And he went to investigate, and he said he came across a craft in the woods. Something came out of it and engulfed him and knocked him out. The boys went and got help and witnessed the whole thing. There's a lot of controversy about that case because supposedly from where the car was parked, the boys couldn't have seen the meadow where the scoutmaster was knocked down by the UFO. And the scoutmaster had a proclivity for making up stories. But there were elements of it that were difficult to explain. And one of them was when they took samples of the grass from that meadow, they found out that the roots were charred, but the blades of grass were not. And they couldn't figure out how those roots would have been charred. It was some kind of evidence that suggests something unusual happened, but they didn't know exactly what. And a lot of the sightings were just that sort of thing. People seeing an object in the sky, a dome disc, a disc-shaped object, a cigar-shaped craft from around the country. And I list an awful lot of those. And the book also lists all the unidentifieds from 1952. So it gives you a little bit of information about those. Interestingly, Bob Cornett, a good friend of mine who passed away just about a year ago, we had an opportunity to go to Maxwell Air Force Base. We were in Air Force ROTC at the time. And an Air Force circular came out and said the Project Blue Books had been moved from Dayton, Ohio to Maxwell Air Force Base, the Air Force Archives. We knew about that. So I called an editor at Saga Magazine. I had been doing UFO articles for Saga Magazine at the time. And I would rarely get them to call me back. They would, well, he's in a meeting, he'll get back to you. So I called one day and of course couldn't get the editor. And I said, well, tell him I can get to the Project Blue Book files, and hung up. And about 5 minutes later, I get the call and says, yeah, okay, here's what we, you do this, do this, do this. And I said, I understand I have the assignment. So we went to Maxwell Air Force Base to look at the Project Blue Book files. The whole point of this is the first thing we did once we got our hands on the index was we went through all 12,000 sightings and wrote down all the unidentifieds. Now, the Air Force, when they released the sightings to the National Archives, they had redacted all the names of the witnesses. They didn't do a very good job because you can usually find a witness name in the file if you read it carefully. Some of you can't. But we had already written down all the names of the witnesses in the unidentified, so we could put all the names back in to the sightings from 1953, all the unidentified sightings. And now there's a guy named Rob Mercer who was able to get an unredacted copy of the index. And so we can put all the names back in. But the point simply is, in the book, there's an appendix that has all the sightings, all 303 of them. It's got the names and the initial information about each of the cases, so that if somebody wants to look it up from the Project Blue Book files, which you can find on Fold 3 or whatever access you might have, you can read that. And if the names aren't in there, you can take them out. And moving back to the Scoutmaster case, the names of the boys were all redacted. And they're scouts, 12 years old. And I'm putting together the book and I'm thinking, well, I don't want to put the kids' names in. Then I realized they're all older than I am. And the names were in the newspaper articles attached to the file. So the Air Force redacted the names in the official investigation, but didn't redact them in the newspaper clippings that were in the file. So you could put all the names back in that way as well. And just one other anecdote about that. In the Arnold sighting, they went through and crossed out, in an interview with Arnold, crossed out his initials, Kenneth Arnold, K.A. They crossed all those out. And yet the first page of it, in letters that are about a half-inch high, it says, somebody had written on it in a grease pencil, Arnold sighting. They got all the little detailing, got rid of his initials, but they missed the big name on the case file. The point is, when you say that, we can look at any number of sightings from around the country, and they're all around the country, where people would see an object in the sky or would see something like that. Oftentimes it was on radar. They had an awful lot of radar cases involved. And, I've always kind of laughed. People say, well, they don't see them on radar. And I'm thinking, A, our stealth technology has probably rendered that argument moot. But second of all, we have lots of radar sightings. And the Washington Nationals are a good case. Not only do we have it on one radar set, if it was temperature inversions, it would have its own individual unique display, but we have it on other radars. The radar operators are talking to one another in the various facilities, and they're spotting the things in the same spot in the same location, doing the same things on the radar scope. So it suggested something more than just a temperature inversion, is something real in the sky.
You've mentioned a few times in this interview Project Blue Book, which was the code name for the systematic study of unidentified flying objects by the U.S. Air Force, created in 1952, the same year UFOs were sighted over the Capitol. That, I'm sure, and I may be wrong, was no small coincidence. Can you, Kevin, tell me about Project Blue Book?
Well, it all really began in 1947 with the Kenneth Arnold sighting that I mentioned there, and of course the Roswell case, which somehow didn't make it into the Blue Book files except for one little paragraph in a news clipping. General Twining, who was the commander of the Air Material Command in 1947, after looking at the summer of 1947 and the number of UFO sightings and the information that had been gathered by the military, suggested that they needed to create a project to investigate UFOs. It was a high priority project, and it was given the code name Project Sign, but people were told, well, it's Project Saucer. I believe it was 1949. The name was compromised, and they did what they called a final analysis from Project Sign, said that we've investigated it, we didn't find anything, and we've closed down Project Sign. What they did was change the name to Project Grudge and kept right on going. And the same thing happened in 1952. Project Grudge evolved into Project Blue Book. So technically, it all began with Project Sign, which officially began in 1948 and went through 1969. But in 1952, as you mentioned, the project name was changed to Project Blue Book at about the time we got all these sightings. And interestingly, it was a time that a number of generals in the Air Force wondered what had been happening to the UFO investigation. And by that time, 1952, it had pretty well devolved into nobody was doing much of anything. They were just writing down excuses or throwing away sightings and not paying any attention. And they brought in Ed Ruppel to revitalize the investigation in 1952. And then that was how he thought, one of the things I need to do is get a clipping service, and he reorganized how the files were kept, and he reorganized an awful lot of stuff. He didn't really come up with the name Unidentified Flying Objects, although he's credited for getting it into widespread use. You can find in the file somebody in a letter would use the term Unidentified Flying Object, but it didn't become the official term for the Air Force until 1952, when Ed Ruppelt kind of solidified that name for the public. So we have that evolution. evolution. And then after 1952, we get to 1953 and the Robertson panel, which was sponsored by the CIA to look at UFOs. And they decided there's nothing to it. Actually, they decided that before they looked at anything, that apparently the final report was written prior to the investigation in January of 1953. And there's a long, I talk about that, I think, in the book. And I know that Mike Swords and Robert Powell, in their book on government and UFOs, or UFOs and government, outline how Robertson, who's the well-respected high-ranking scientist in the government, sat through a week of meetings with this, and on a Friday night went home and wrote the final report and produced it on Saturday morning, and a number of guys had signed off on it. And you're thinking, yeah, I don't think so. Something was written before they got to that point. But of course, they decided we need to debunk flying saucers. We need to remove the mystery. And once that happened, then Project Blue Book devolved in now to a debunking and a public relations outfit, which was finally closed in 1969.
In this updated version of your 2000 book, Kevin, you've included a number of new witness interviews. Could you share some of them?
I'm not really sure where you want to go with that. I talked to an awful lot of people, and some of the stuff, I gathered before, and we've been able to bring it up. Two of the important witnesses, as I said, were Al Chop and Dewey Fournay, and I was able to talk to both of those guys and get their take on what was happening. In fact, Al Chop, if you remember the old movie UFO, Al Chop is in the movie as a character. He's played by Tom Towers. And I was talking to Al Chop about that, and he said he hadn't seen the movie. And I said, would you like a copy? Because I think at Turner Classic Movies, one of them had just shown it not too long before I talked to Al Chop, and I had recorded it on videotape. So I made a copy and sent it to Al Chop so he could see that movie. You talk to those guys, and they're telling you what they saw at the time and what they were doing. And you get a feeling for what was going on in the rooms. And you see this sort of thing, and it tells you that what you've heard, some of the things you've heard over the years, some of the myths that have grown up around that just aren't true. And when I talk about the myths, I'm talking about the explanations and the way some of the investigations were done. And here are the guys who were inside the radar room on the second night watching this whole thing go down. That's quite important to understand, that you've got that kind of observation. Now, I will say that my interviews with them were conducted long after 1952. So, you've got to remember that people's memories fade. Things are added that weren't there. You have to be careful when you're dealing with memories that are 40 or 50 years old when you're talking to the witness. And we all can think about events back in our own lives, and you think you remember it one way, and then you find some documentation, you find some photograph that says, oh, well, that wasn't quite right. In fact, I do a blog called Vietnam Ground Zero, and I say it's my relatively true account of my experiences in Vietnam. And one of the stories I talk about is I had told people for years that I left my Thanksgiving meal on the tray in the serving line in our mess hall because the flight had been scrambled. Now, the flight that happened frequently, where we would be back at our base and we would be in the mess hall waiting for the next mission to come on, and the flight would be scrambled. We'd leave everything and we'd just run. Turns out I'd sent a letter to my parents. I have the letter now. And I was reading that, and it turned out that we weren't at our base on Thanksgiving. We were actually in Tay Ninh, and we were promised a meal there, and we had to pay for it. And I said in the letter, it was a pretty crummy meal too. So while it's true, we did periodically leave our trays on the service line or on the table when the flight was scrambled. It just didn't happen on Thanksgiving. And so the memory is accurate, but not about it being Thanksgiving. But I was able to correct that. And that's the point. I had thought it was Thanksgiving. It happened on Thanksgiving, and it didn't. And the point simply is sometimes your memories get altered as you access them or you relate them to other people or things intervene. So you have to look at it from an investigative point of view. What other corroboration you have? Well, was Al Chop and Dewey Fournay in the room? Yeah, everybody says so. Ruppelt in his 1956 book talks about him being in the room. So I was able to talk to them. I talked to Roger Newhouse, who took the film in Tremonton, Utah in July of 1952, and was able to talk about what he had seen. And the film is really kind of crummy. It's just lights in the distance, and you really can't make out any detail, and they're kind of maneuvering around there. And I saw the explanation was it was seagulls. Well, in Utah, seagulls are in Utah. They're very bright. And I saw a music video, and there were seagulls in the background of it. And for all the world, they looked an awful lot like the images in the Newhouse film. But the problem is, Newhouse told me that he'd seen the object close up before he got his camera out of the trunk and started filming. And they had moved off. He'd flown over the car, and his wife had seen him, and his children had seen him, and they were disc-shaped craft or oval-shaped craft. And he told Ed Ruppelt the same thing. And Ruppelt said nobody, when they did the initial investigation with Newhouse, nobody thought to ask him what the craft looked like, because he'd taken movies. And so we could go back and look at that. Now, Newhouse did say he'd used 50 feet of film. I think in that time, 16 millimeter film came in 3 minutes canisters he was a Navy photographer. And so he had a professional level 16 millimeter camera, and it was in the trunk of the car as he was moving to a different base. What he said, is he sent the whole thing to the Navy, and they kind of chopped it up. Well, it turns out he'd actually, on the beginning of the film, there was some footage of the family at a park, national park. So he didn't take the whole 3 minutes of the UFO. So they did take that family stuff off. So they did cut the film. But he thought the whole film was of the UFOs, and it wasn't. The Navy investigated, and they said this was an internally lighted source. It wasn't reflective of sunlight. If the objects were craft of some kind, they had to be X number of distance away. And if the further away you got, the faster they were moving. And they concluded that they didn't know what it was. The Robertson panel determined they were seagulls. And I have to say, legitimately, one video, and I actually posted a link on my blog to the music video, so you could see the seagulls in the background, and you don't see any evidence of the wing flapping. They just kind of glide across the background. But I think if the length of the film kind of eliminates that, because there was no evidence of any flapping of wings, which you would have gotten had the seagulls been the explanation. And I think they would have resolved themselves at some point. And then you have the testimony of the witnesses that they'd seen the objects at much closer range, and they were not seagulls. So, take a look at that. That's some of the testimony. I talked to any number of people. I got some information from the HUFON, which is a Houston UFO network. I think it was affiliated with MUFON. And they'd interviewed a pilot who had been involved in one of the intercepts. And I did find some transcripts from other pilots who were involved that was able to include in the book. So we updated all the information. So it's the best and most accurate information we had in today's environment looking back. And that's the other thing, you do a book and you use the best information available. And it always seems to happen. The minute the book is submitted, you find something else which was relevant that you couldn't include in it because you didn't have it at the time. And I'm finishing up a book called 1973, which deals with all the sightings from 1973, including the Hickson Parker. But I've been in communication with Mr. Calvin Parker recently, so I've got some information from him. And I think if we're going to take a look at an abduction case, and I don't mean to go off on the tangent here, but we look at an abduction case, this is the one that's probably the most solid of the ones I've seen. Calvin Parker's put out a couple of books through the Flying Disc Press, and you can find them on Amazon, of course, where he relates this, and you can see some documentation relating to other witnesses, not just them, but witnesses in other parts of Pascagoula seeing the object at the time of the abduction. So it's a very complicated case. And that's where we are with the 1952 case. You got all these witnesses from all these locations talking about what they'd seen.
In Invasion Washington, you've also changed some conclusions you came to in that earlier book. What, Kevin, were those changes, and what were the factors that contributed to you making them?
What causes a change like that is additional information. I mean, you take a look at any kind of an investigation, be it a criminal investigation or a UFO investigation or whatever, you have to be careful you don't focus on a specific thing. You get tunnel vision and you focus on this and you just kind of ignore all the other information. And what we need to do is expand our view. That's kind of what happened. Or you find information that's relevant to the case later on about a case. So you take a look at all of that sort of thing and you apply it to the investigation. And I know there's investigations. Jerry Clark and I have argued about the Charles Whitted sighting, which is 1948, where they saw what they claimed was a cigar-shaped craft with windows on it. I am absolutely convinced now, after looking at that and seeing a number of videos on YouTube called, there's one, and I don't know if it's still up. I saw it like a decade ago or 2 decades ago, called a video compilation, and it's 3 minutes and 19 seconds. And it's just people who do accidentally captured meteor falls. And there's one or two of them where you see the object breaking up and it strings out and it looks like a lighted cockpit with square windows. And in 1968, there was the reentry of a Soviet satellite deorbited. And as it broke up, people described a cigar-shaped craft with square windows on it. Most people understood what they had seen, but there was always that small number. And so Jerry Clark and I argue about that case, and I think it's been solved. It was one of the unidentifieds, and it was one of the critical cases in the early investigations. I think that case has been solved based on the 1968 Zond 4 reentry and seeing these meteor compilations and how the meteors can break up and give you the impression of a lighted cockpit and square windows, especially if you just get a second or two view of the thing as it breaks up and fades out. And so that's how you end up looking at a case that was mysterious at one point, but later on, as you get additional information and our knowledge increases, you see, well, this explanation does make some sense. I think in the Charles Whitted case, I think the first explanation, Hynek came up, I said, when he was first told about it, says, it sounds like a meteor. And then they went off and said it was unidentified. And now we're to the point where I think it's a meteor. I think Hynek was right in his original assessment. And so you go through a case and you look at all of these sorts of things and you bring that to bear on the investigation. And the other thing you have to do is you have to go back and look at what other writers have written, because if you do not follow up on what they've written, you may be led astray. And one of the best examples of that is, again, from 1947. I was looking for any sighting in which the witness said it was saucer-shaped or oval-shaped prior to Kenneth Arnold's sighting bursting on the scene. And Frank Edwards wrote about, and it's in Richard Hall's The UFO Evidence, which was published in 1964, a case from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where an engineer saw 9 disc-shaped objects the day before the Arnold sighting. And I thought, great, there it is. But I went to the library and pulled the newspaper, the Cedar Rapids Gazette, for that day, for June 24th, and the sighting's not there. And I looked the day before and it's not there. So I kept going through the newspaper. And finally, on June 28th, there's a story that says, "Strange object seen in fast flight," I think is the headline. And you read down it, and here's the story. The guy was a railroad engineer, meaning he drove the train. He didn't build railroads. He wasn't in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He was in Peoria, Illinois. And he was talking about how he'd seen the things on the afternoon of June 24th, the same day that Arnold saw his sighting. But it wasn't published until June 28th or June 28th, 29th, somewhere like that. So it was days later. So it didn't help. But by chasing down the original source, I was able to correct some of the problems with that story. And that's how it comes about in other cases. You chase it to the original sources. You have to look for the original sources. I do something on my blog called Chasing Footnotes. And that's exactly what I do. I look at a footnote, or usually I just stumble across it. I'm not looking for it to do. It's just something I stumble across. If a footnote leads you to a source and you say, well, I've got that source. And you look it up and say, well, it takes you to another source, and you finally get to the source and you find out, well, the story has been slightly altered through the telling. And now you're back to the original source and you get it back. Sometimes the original source is the same as the source you're looking at. I mean, the information was communicated properly and accurately, but oftentimes you can say, well, here's where we are on this sort of story. So you have to take a look at all of that sort of thing and get an idea of what the original sources say and chase them down. And that's something you can do more easily today's environment with the internet. Something that wasn't easy 25 years ago because the internet wasn't as expansive as it was. And if you're looking at something that you're trying to do in the early 1990s, you don't have the internet to type in a question and see where it leads you. But when you do that, you have to make sure that you vet that source so that you can make sure that the information on the internet isn't inaccurate based on the misrepresentations and the inadvertent misrepresentations of some of the other investigators because they didn't have access to all the information we have today.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to purchase the Washington Nationals Flying Saucers Over the Capitol and also learn about your other books, how can they do that?
Well, Amazon is a perfect place to do it. And just type in my name and it'll bring it up. Or you can go to my blog because there's usually links to the latest UFO books on my blog, which is kevinrandle.blogspot.com. If you've got a specific question about a sighting and I've covered it, there's a search engine that will lead you to that, and that will maybe lead you to other books. There's my books on Roswell are there, including Understanding Roswell, which was a book I did not that long ago that updated as we did with Washington Nationals, the Roswell information. There's Roswell in the 21st Century, which provides an in-depth look at the case. There's a book on Levelland, which were these sightings in Levelland, Texas in 1957, where literally dozens of people, according to the sheriff, called to report their cars being stalled by the close approach of a UFO. And then that kind of leads us, into the extraterrestrial, because what kind of natural phenomena would do that? But there's all those books there. You can take a look at that. So Amazon's got all the books listed.
Kevin Randle, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. It's always a pleasure yakking with you.
Yeah, and right back at you. It's always a pleasure yakking at you as well.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. To be sure you're amongst the first to receive new interviews when they're released and to have access to previous ones, subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, all you have to do is press the subscribe button on your screen.